friends. I'm so glad that you're with me again today. Today I brought my Flat Mrs. Whitney with me to read Flat Stanley. But before we read today, I wanted to talk with you about the questions for Chapter 2, so that when I'm reading, you can be listening for the answers to the questions. That'll make your work a little easier after we're done. Okay, let me read those questions to you now. So the questions are for Chapter 2. Let's start with number 1. What emotion is Arthur feeling? An emotion is happy, sad, anxious, worried, nervous. Lots of different emotions he could be feeling. What emotion would you be feeling if you were Flat? I think I'd be pretty nervous. We'll see how Arthur's feeling at the beginning of Chapter 2. There's a second part to number 1. What does the picture help you to understand about this emotion? So I'll show you the picture and you can look. Number 2. Why were the policemen willing to, and it says here apologies, but I'm sure that the person meant apologize. Why were the policemen willing to apologize to Mrs. Lambchop? Well, I hope they don't have trouble with the police in this chapter. Number 3, what is the Lambchop's idea for getting Stanley to California? Number 4, what do you think about their choice? Explain your thinking. Number 5, why would Thomas label the envelope with so many words? We haven't met Thomas yet. Thomas is a new character in the story. So far we've met Mrs. and Mr. Lambchop. We've met his brother Arthur. We met a doctor and a nurse who was doing measurements, Dr. Dan, yeah? But we have not yet met Thomas. And number 6, what did you think of the Lambchop's reaction to his trip after he came home? So how did they react, and what do you think about the way that they reacted? Do you think it was an appropriate reaction? Let's find out. Chapter 2, Being Flat. There's the picture they were talking about. Again, question number 1. What emotion is Arthur feeling? Oh, Arthur, not Stanley. Arthur. Oh, there he is. How does the picture help you to understand about this emotion? How do you think he looks there? He doesn't look happy to me. Okay, let's go ahead and read and find out. When Stanley got used to being flat, he enjoyed it. He could go in and out of rooms even when the door was closed just by lying down and sliding through a crack in the bottom. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop said it was silly, but they were really quite proud of him. Arthur got jealous and tried to slide under a door, but he just banged his head. Well, I can't blame him for being jealous since Stanley's getting all the attention now. And Stanley he is able to do some pretty amazing tricks. Being flat could also be helpful, Stanley found. He was taking a walk with Mrs. Lambchop one afternoon when her favorite ring fell from her finger. The ring rolled across the sidewalk, and where do you think it went? And down between the bars of a grating that covered a deep, dark shaft. Mrs. Lambchop began to cry. I have an idea, Stanley said. He took the laces out of his shoes and an extra pair out of his pocket and tied them all together to make one long lace. Then he tied one end of that to the back of his belt and gave the other end to his mother. Lower me, he said, and I will look for the ring. There he is in the grate. I think he's going to be able to find it just fine. Thank you, Stanley, Mrs. Lambchop said. She lowered him between the bars and moved him carefully up and down from side to side so that he could search the whole floor of the shaft. 2 policemen came by. Oh, here are those policemen. And stared at Mrs. Lambchop as she stood holding the long lace that ran through the grating. She pretended not to notice them. What's the matter, lady? The first policeman asked. Is your yo-yo stuck? I'm not playing with a yo-yo, Mrs. Lambchop said sharply. My son is at the other end of this lace, if you must know. Can you imagine what those police officers are thinking? They must think she's out of her mind. Here we go. But there he is down there, and I can see the ring. Can you see the ring? Get the net, Harry, said the second policeman. We've caught a cuckoo. Just then, down in the shaft, Stanley cried out, Hooray! Mrs. Lambchop pulled him up and saw that he had the ring. Good for you, Stanley, she said. Then she turned angrily to the policeman. A cuckoo indeed, she said. Shame. The policeman apologized. We didn't get it, lady, they said. We've been hasty. We can see that now. People should think twice before making rude remarks, said Mrs. Lambchop, and not make them at all. And here he is, proving that indeed he was down in the shaft, and there's the ring. The policemen realized that was a good rule, and they said they would try to remember it. One day, Stanley got a letter from his friend Thomas Anthony Jeffrey, whose family had moved recently to California. A school vacation was about to begin, and Stanley was invited to spend it with the Jeffreys. Oh, how fun, to spend a vacation with his friends. That does sound like fun. Oh, boy, Stanley said, I would love to go. Mr. Lambchop sighed. A round-trip train or airplane ticket to California is very expensive, he said. I will have to think of some cheaper way. What is a cheap way they could get Stanley to California? Do you have an idea? I bet you do. When Mr. Lambchop came home from the office that evening, he brought with him an enormous brown paper envelope. Here he is. Now then, Stanley, he said, try this on for size. The envelope fit Stanley very well. There was even room left over, Mrs. Lambchop discovered, for an egg salad sandwich made with thin bread and a toothbrush case filled with milk. We definitely know this story is a fantasy, right? Because would anyone ever ship their child off in an envelope with those things? I don't think so. They had to put a great many stamps on the envelope to pay for both airmail and insurance, but it was still very much less expensive than a train or an airplane ticket to California. The next day, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop slid Stanley into his envelope, along with the egg salad sandwich and the toothbrush case full of milk, and they mailed him from the box on the corner. The mailbox. We don't deliver quite as many things by mail as we used to. This is 50 years ago, so lots and lots of things were mailed. This was before internet. The envelope had to be folded to fit right through the slot, but Stanley was a limber boy, and inside the box he straightened right up again. Mrs. Lambchop was nervous because Stanley had never been away from home alone before. She rapped on the box. Can you hear me, dear? She called. Are you all right? Stanley's voice came quite clearly. I'm fine. Can I eat my sandwich now? Wait an hour and try not to get overheated, dear, Mrs. Lambchop said. Then she and Mr. Lambchop cried out, Goodbye, goodbye, and they went home. Can you imagine? That's so ridiculous. There they are, though, putting him in the mailbox. Stanley had a fine time in California. When the visit was over, the Jeffreys returned him in a beautiful white envelope they had made themselves. It had red and blue markings to show that it was airmail, and Thomas Jeffrey lettered it, that means wrote the letters on it, valuable and fragile, and this end up on both sides, so the letter would not be upside down in the mailbox, right? Or in the mail truck, or when delivered. Back home, Stanley told his family that he had been handled so carefully that he never felt a single bump. Mr. Lambchop said it proved that jet planes were wonderful, and so was the postal service, and that this was a great age in which to live. Stanley thought so too. Okay, kids, before I let you go, let's take a second look at the questions. What emotion is Arthur feeling? And how does that picture help you to understand this emotion? If you don't remember the answer, you can always go back to the beginning of the video, or if you have access to Epic, you can look there too for the real book. Same book as I'm reading. Number 2, why were the policemen willing to apologize to Mrs. Lambchop? Number 3, what is the lamb chop's idea for getting Stanley to California? Number 4, what do you think about their choice? Explain your thinking. Number 5, why would Thomas label the envelope with so many words? Why did he put so many words? Fragile and this side up and words like that. Why did he do that, do you think? And the last question is, what did you think of the lamb chop's reaction to his trip after he came home? This is a thinking question. What do you think? Do you think their reaction was normal, or do you think their reaction was rather unusual to have their son shipped home in an envelope and for him to reflect on the vacation cheerfully and for them to act as if nothing had happened at all? What do you think of that? All right. Well, probably not tomorrow, maybe next week. I'll see you later. Bye.